Good evening and welcome to this very special event. My name is Jeff Greenman. I serve as the president at Regent College in Vancouver, BC, and I'm part of the sponsoring of this event along with the Trinity Forum and Reformed Theological Seminary. We're glad to collaborate together to make this evening possible, and we're delighted that you're here. Every time I come to Washington, I feel a rise in the level of energy. It's a very busy place, so you've made time tonight to be here. I want to thank you for making that commitment to be a part of this conversation. And especially on a night like this. This is September 11th, and I'm sure that you remember where you were on September 11th, 2001. I remember where I was. I wonder if as we begin, we could just take a moment of silence so that we might pray for those whose lives have been impacted by the events of September 11th. Let's just take a few moments for silent prayer. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. It's good to be together tonight to gather in a conversation that engenders faith and hope and love for such a time as this. I hope that this evening does that. Let me say a little bit about this series. This is the first of a three-part conversation on the theme of art, faith, and formation. We're collaborating together, RTS and Regent and Trinity Forum, to put this together. Why? Because we think this is a conversation that matters. It's one that needs to happen. A conversation to look at the ways in which literary and musical and visual arts speak to the spiritual hunger of our times in order to shape a sense of beauty and truth and purpose that's important for all of us. Exploring the implications of caring for and cultivating the arts in reinvigorating, sustaining a healthy culture. So tonight, we're particularly going to have a chance to explore the power and significance of poetry to shape the moral and spiritual imagination of individuals and cultures, and we look forward to that. As I said, this event is co-sponsored. The three organizations have come together, three organizations with a lot in common, but different in our own ways too. But I think each of us feels that we have a stake in this conversation around the ability of Christianity to speak into the public square and the ability of Christians to be equipped to live faithfully in every realm of their service of God and in every realm of our society. Let me just say very briefly a little word about Regent College in Vancouver, BC. Some of you know of it, and I hope more of you will come to know of it if you don't. Regent College is celebrating now its 50th anniversary, and the claim to fame that we may have is being the first graduate school of theology primarily for lay people. Our founding father, Dr. Jim Houston, who many of you know, liked to say that the purpose of Regent was to cultivate a mature faith so that people would live out that mature faith with just as much depth and substance as they had in their vocational, professional lives. A connection between the deep roots of faith and the way that we live our lives in every realm of society. That's what it was about primarily for lay people, and we have carried on in that mission ever since. From the very, very beginning of Regent College, the arts have been a part of the conversation. The arts have been integral to this vision of equipping God's people to live faithfully in our culture. The very first teaching of Regent College was summer school, 1969. We've just had 50 of those summer schools. And there was a Canadian poet, an award-winning Canadian poet by the name of Margaret Avison, who taught at the very first summer school. At least our speaker tonight recognizes the name, even if you don't. And since then, poetry has been a part of our world ever since. Our quarterly theological journal publishes poetry in every issue. A renowned British poet, Malcolm Guite, had a packed-out course on poetry this summer. Lucy Shaw, some of you will know the poetry of Lucy Shaw. She's been poet in residence for us for a long time. So we have been deeply invested in the conversation around the arts and poetry has been one of the favorites along the way. So it's natural for us as Regent College to partner in this conversation around theology and the arts and what this means as we engage our culture. It's right up our alley, and we're delighted to be partnering with it. I want to introduce a couple of people from our Regent world who are with us here. In the front row, Roger Lang, just put your hand up there. Roger is the chair of our board from Regent. He's from Calgary, Alberta. Connolly Gillum, I don't know where there she is, next door to Roger, maybe serving as his bodyguard for the evening. A board member of Regent, a classmate of mine as a student of Regent many years ago, and then Lucila Crenna, who's been at our table. She's a Regent alum and also teaches at Regent part-time in our program in Leadership, Theology, and Society. So we're delighted to be here and wonderful to see you as a part of this evening. Do plan on being back for parts 2 and 3 of our series. And now I'll turn it over to Cherie Harder, who's going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Jeff, for that, and I'll just add my own welcome to all of you to tonight's evening conversation on poetry, imagination, and spiritual formation. I'm Cherie Harder, the president of the Trinity Forum, and on behalf of all of us at the Trinity Forum, we are delighted to partner with Regent College as well as Reformed Theological Seminary in hosting this event. As Jeff alluded to, this is actually the first in a 3-part series that we're going to be hosting on art, faith, and spiritual formation. I'll be tackling the literary arts tonight, and in the future hope to tackle the musical arts and visual arts as well. So we'll be sending out more information on that. Stay tuned for that. We would love to welcome you back. But we're also delighted that each and every one of you is here tonight on a momentous night to hear about poetry. I'd also like to recognize just a few special guests of the Trinity Forum. We're really delighted that our chairman of the board, Byron Smith, is here. Byron, if you could just wave to everybody. As well as one of our senior fellows and frequent speakers, Mako Fujimura, who is here as well. And we're also delighted to welcome different public servants. We have National Endowments for the Arts Chairman, John Peedy, who is here somewhere. Thank you, John. If you had friends who wanted to be here, but tonight, fear not, we are both live streaming the event as well as recording it, and we'll have it up on video in short order. We're live streaming tonight both on our YouTube page and on our Facebook page, so you can reach it either way. And we'll have a video recording up on both our YouTube channel as well as our website at www.ttf.org. We're also going to have pictures up on Facebook, so feel free to tag your friends. And if you'd like to respond in the moment to the ideas you hear tonight, you can do so at #TTFTonight on Twitter. It's also a pleasure to see many new faces in the audience. Just looking out over the crowd, I know many of you, this is your first time here, and a particular welcome to you. And if you are not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we provide a space and resources for the discussion of life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And for a long time, the great questions of life have been assumed to focus on the purpose and the content of the good life, which in turn was assumed to be inextricably tied to our understanding of truth, goodness, and beauty. And historically, one of the most important means of discerning, contemplating, and enjoying those traditional virtues was the art and practice of poetry. It has been through poetry that epics were committed to memory, that much of the Bible came to us, that the great myths were transmitted, and that the capacity for imagination and the longing of the human spirit for beauty and truth were shaped. But over the last half century or more, in many ways, poetry has become increasingly marginalized and largely ignored by high culture, largely relegated to university English departments or college town poetry slams, and been ignored not only by the broader public, but by churches, who were once among the chief patrons of the arts. Our guest tonight has been among the most outspoken and effective critics of the current state of poetry, but will also make the case for its power in forming the moral and spiritual imagination of both individuals and cultures. It is a fascinating and a provocative argument, and it is hard to imagine a speaker who could make it with more passion, persuasiveness, or panache than our keynote speaker tonight, Dana Gioia. Dana is a renowned poet and an unusual one in that he's also served as a literary critic and essayist, a marketing executive and academic, as well as the head of a federal agency, not things that often go together. He's an internationally renowned poet and has served as the poet laureate of California for the last 4 years, has published 5 full-length poetry collections, including Daily Horoscope, The Gods of Winter, which won the Poets Prize, Interrogations at Noon, which won the National Book Award, Pity the Beautiful, and his latest, 99 poems, New and Selective. He's an active translator of poetry from Latin, Italian, and German, has composed 4 different opera libretti, and won the Taylor-Aiken Award for Lifetime Achievement in American Poetry. If that's not enough, as a critic and author, Dana's provocative book, Can Poetry Matter?, which began as an article for The Atlantic and generated more reader response than any article had up until that point, is credited with reviving the role of poetry in American culture. He's published numerous additional works of criticism, including essays on poetry in the American culture, Disappearing Ink, and The Barrier of a Common Language, as well as contributing to over a half-dozen different literary anthologies. A former marketing executive, he is arguably one of the most successful chairmen of the National Endowment for the Arts in our nation's history. Appointed by the president and unanimously confirmed by the Senate twice, quite an accomplishment, that alone, succeeded in strengthening support for a previously and subsequently embattled agency, was named by Business Week as the man who saved the NEA. While he was there, he established Poetry Out Loud, a national recitation contest involving more than 150,000 high school students who took their turn reciting poetry, as well as launching the Big Read, the largest literary program in the history of the country, where more than 400 communities held month-long celebrations of literature. Since leaving the NEA, Dana was named the Judge Whitney Professor of Poetry and Public Culture at the University of Southern California and has received 10 honorary doctorates. He's also married to Mary Gioia, who I'm delighted to say has joined us tonight as well. Responding to Dana will be Dr. Scott Redd. Scott is the president of and professor of Old Testament at the DC campus of Reformed Theological Seminary, one of our partners in our 3-part series. He has taught and written extensively on the subject of poetry in the Hebrew Bible and is the author of the recent work, The Wholeness Imperative, How Christ Unifies Our Desires, Identity, and Impact in the World. Previously, Scott served as the dean on the faculty of Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando and has also taught at the Catholic University of America, the Augustine Theological Institute in Malta, the International Training Institute at the Mediterranean Basin, and Third Millennium Ministries. He serves on the board of the Washington Theological Consortium, an ecumenical gathering of institutions for theological education in the DC area, and writes on a wide variety of issues for the New York Times, the Washington Post, First Things, and Christianity Today, among many others. He is married to Jennifer, who is here tonight, as well as his parents, and we're delighted to welcome them. After Dana's keynote address, we'll hear a short response from Scott, and then both Dana and Scott will join me on stage for a short moderated conversation, followed by questions from the audience. Dana, welcome.
Leave the stage at the end of it, or sit there?
Leave and then.
Good evening. It is always a pleasure to be at Trinity Forum. In fact, when I was first asked to give this address, my initial idea was to make the talk about the audience, which is to say, what is the importance that a community of Christian artists and intellectuals has for our society? But when Cherie told me that I would be speaking on September 11th, I felt that I had to change my subject and to talk about something that was appropriate for this solemn anniversary. Tonight, I will be speaking on poetry, the imagination, and spiritual formation, which is a ridiculously broad subject, and also a rather complicated topic, with no obvious connection to 9/11. So I will have to ask you to trust me for a couple of minutes, especially since I'm going to begin rather ploddingly by defining the key words in the title so that we can all begin this conversation with some sort of common footing. I will try to be as quick as clarity allows. First, poetry. Now, I'm sure that everyone in the room understands poetry in a fairly good way. Poetry is a special way of speaking which invites and rewards a special way of listening. And as writing developed, it became a special way of writing that invites and rewards a special way of reading. It is an ancient art. It is primeval. It is as old as humanity, and it predates history, which is to say that before history was ever written, it was put into poetry. But the important thing to remember this evening is that poetry, and by extension, everything the Greeks would have called poesis, making, all of the arts, represent a separate and distinct way of perceiving and communicating reality and our place in it. Poetry is not superior to philosophy or science, but it is distinct, it is different, and it is irreplaceable. Poetry captures the world holistically, and it conveys its meanings experientially, simultaneously addressing our intellect, our emotions, our imagination, our intuition, our personal and collective memories, and our physical bodies without asking us to separate those faculties. In other words, we experience poetry, and this is why it is irreplaceable, exactly as we experience life, not as an intellectual abstraction, but as embodied experience. And I said that poetry is not superior to philosophy and science, but in its distinction, it is equal and equally irreplaceable because there are many truths that we cannot convey except as stories, as songs, as images. Now, imagination is an everyday word, but it's also a complicated one. In vernacular usage, imagination is the mental ability to form new ideas and images. But the word has a long history. If you go back to the Renaissance, people would contrast imagination with reason. And they would say that poetry is an art that comes out of the power of the imagination. Philosophy is a study that comes out of the power of reason. Imagination imitated, represented reality. Philosophy analyzed it. And the tradition had an image for poetry, which was the mirror. And we all know this from Hamlet, where Hamlet's talking to the players, and he says that the purpose of playing, which is to say the purpose of playwriting, and by extension all literature, is to hold as 'twere a mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her image, and the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure. But by the Romantic era, the sense of what creative imagination actually did began to change. The metaphor went from the mirror, which reflects reality, to the lamp, which illuminates and therefore reveals reality. Imagination was now more properly seen as a creative and investigative power that perceived and communicated the interrelationships of reality. It brought forth what William Wordsworth, the poet, called untaught things, new revelations, new insights into life. Though, of course, Shakespeare predicted exactly this formulation, and if you may remember from Midsummer Night's Dream when he's talking about the poet in his fine frenzy rolling, as imagination bodies forth to forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Finally, spiritual formation. Now, this is a unspeakably vast subject to which many people devote their entire lives. There was a Dominican sister who called me yesterday saying that she was not able to come here. Why? Because she is directing the formation of a convent. And this is a lifelong 24/7 job. So this room is probably full of people that know more about spiritual formation than I do. But for the purposes of tonight's discussion, let me offer just this brief definition. By spiritual formation, I mean those practices and disciplines by which individuals and communities, like us here tonight, deepen, shape, and refine their hearts and minds, or to be very Catholic about it, their intellect and their will, to bring themselves in closer relation to the divine. Now, these practices traditionally include prayer, meditation, fasting, study, mortification, service, pilgrimage. I have labored over these preliminaries to ask a very simple question. What role, if any, does poetry and the imagination play in spiritual formation? Or more specifically, what role does the creative imagination as embodied in poetry play in Christian spiritual formation, both for the author and for the reader? Now, I'm going to try to answer this question, or at least begin to answer it, by looking at a single poem this evening. But before I do, I want to just make a very commonsensical observation. If you know anything about the lives of poets, you can rest assured that the practice of poetry does not necessarily make you a very good person. And indeed, you see some poets whose lives show extraordinary spiritual development. Think of Dante going from the romantic self-absorption of La Vita Nuova, or Goethe going from his, to the Paradiso in Dante's case, to Goethe, from the kind of self-pitying, self-destructive, genius of the Sorrows of the Young Werther, to the second part of Faust. You see, in a sense, their growth, but you also see poets of true genius. To name two of my favorites, Charles Baudelaire, or the American poet Weldon Keys, who at the age of 41 killed himself by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, who despite all of their genius, despite all of their intensity, find themselves locked into a spiritual trap from which they cannot escape. So what I want to look at is a very great poem by the person I think as the most important Christian poet in English since T.S. Eliot, Wystan Hugh Auden, and to look at a poem that is uniquely appropriate for the anniversary we remember tonight. The poem is W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939. Now, the problem with studying spiritual formation is that it's invisible. by and large, as looking, we don't really know what's going on in somebody's heart and mind, or at least it's usually invisible. I'm going to suggest that in the case of Auden's great poem, we can actually observe moment by moment the process of his poetic imagination guiding and awakening his spirit into a new form. Now, September 1st, 1939 is a poem which almost anyone who was an adult on September 11th, 2001 became familiar with. It appeared everywhere as I think the most relevant imaginative response to the experience America was going through after the destruction of the Twin Towers, the attack on the Pentagon. And it was written by Auden on the day that World War II began, when Hitler invaded Poland. I'm going to recite the whole poem just to make sure people have it fresh in their memory. But I want to say a few things about it. Now, the poem, probably like a lot of great Christian poems, takes place in a bar. It takes place in a bar in Midtown Manhattan. Actually, we know on 52nd Street. People have actually been able to identify the bar that it takes place in. 52nd Street at that point was called Swing Street because it was full of very small jazz clubs. The poet sits at the bar, which is crowded, with music playing around him, and he's facing what's often at the back of a bar, which is a mirror, which once again, one of the symbols for the imagination. The poem is 99 lines long, and it's full of allusions that you won't know. Nonetheless, I think it will immediately communicate. I'll just make three of them. Adolf Hitler was born in Linz, Austria. Václav Nijinsky, was one of the greatest ballet dancers and choreographers of all time. He was the star of the Ballet Russe that was managed by Serge Diaghilev. And Thucydides is the ancient Greek historian whose book chronicled the destruction of democratic Athens by militaristic Sparta. September 1st, 1939. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the light and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offense from Luther until now that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz, what huge imago made a psychopathic God. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech could say about democracy and what dictators do, the elderly rubbish they talk to an apathetic grave, analyzed all in his book, Enlightenment Driven Away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement, and grief. We must suffer them all again. Into this neutral air where blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man. Each language pours its vain, competitive excuse. But who can live for long in a euphoric dream? Out of the mirror they stare, imperialism's face and the international wrong. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. The windiest militant trash important people shout is not so crude as our wish. What Mad Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart, for the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. From the conservative dark into the ethical light, the dense commuters come, repeating their morning vow. I will be true to my wife. I'll concentrate more on my work. And hopeless governors wake to resume their compulsory game. Who can release them now? Who can reach the deaf? Who can speak for the dumb? All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensuous man on the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, the world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them, of Eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Now, let me make 3 initial observations about that poem before we analyze it. First, on August 31st, 1939, Auden had no plans to write this poem. He may have been pondering the issues, but the reality of events had not brought them into a creative expression. So what this poem does is gives us a vantage point into a great poet's mind as he begins, in a sense, to formulate what becomes one of the most influential poems he ever wrote. Secondly, on September 10th, 2001, this poem was virtually unknown in the United States outside of a small group of specialists. And one of the main reasons that was true was that Auden himself had suppressed the poem over 40 years earlier. He had dropped it from his collected work, and he refused to allow it to be reprinted. Auden's called September 1st, 1939, the most dishonest poem I have ever written. His problem with the poem focused on one line, the poem's most famous line: we must love one another or die. No, he said, we will die anyway. So the first thing he did was that he changed it to we must love one another and die. But that just is a flat line. And then I actually brought a Xerox of the poem. I know the poem by heart, so I don't really need this. But I bought a copy of Auden's book Another Time that he had autographed for a woman in, I think, Alabama in 1947. And when he came to this poem, he crossed that whole stanza out. So the next thing Auden did was to drop the stanza, but he realized the poem didn't work without the stanza, so he then dropped the entire poem. The third observation I want to make is that on September 1st, 1939, Auden was a secular thinker whose public ideology was a mix of many sources, but mostly Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Yet by October 1940, Auden had rejoined the Christian church as a serious believer, a sort of Kierkegaardian Christian immersed in the early church fathers, especially St. Augustine. How did these things happen? I believe that the poem prefigures Auden's spiritual transformation that led not only to his conversion, but to his suppression of this famous poem, and that studying the poem reveals the turning point in Auden's spiritual formation. Now, once again, let me give a couple of observations, because September 1st, 1939 is a great poem, but it is also a thorny bouquet of contradictions and ironies. First, it is one of the greatest political poems in the English language. Memorable, original, and moving, mixing the personal and public, full of profound political, historical, and psychological insights. But it is ultimately a poem which discards politics as a mode of achieving, in a sense, overcoming the problems of humanity. Second, it is a deeply religious poem, although it is never considered that critically, because it never mentions God, religion, or church. In fact, the only religious figure who appears in it is Martin Luther, who is seen as the beginning of this strange turn in German culture that ends up with Adolf Hitler. So Hitler, somehow Luther is the person who is at the beginning of what has driven a culture mad. Now, third and finally, this is a great poem that achieved immediate distinction, that was not only rejected, but suppressed. And the poem shows stage by stage, I think, the process by which Auden became the person who suppressed it. Now, the poem begins at a juncture between the personal and political, as a war breaks out that will change everyone's life. I sit in a dive on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Why is it dishonest? Because Chamberlain and everyone else is trying to appease Hitler. There are all of these things that are going on that are being done to promote peace, but they're all going to essentially break out in war. The author tries to understand the situation that he's in intellectually, using the tools by which his ideology is formed, sort of Marxist, historical and economic analysis, Freudianism, history, but they don't seem helpful. So if you look at this, the next two stanzas, he's talking about intellectual things. Accurate scholarship will unearth the whole offense from Luther until now that has driven a culture mad, find out what occurred at Linz. But it doesn't go anywhere. So all he can say is that I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Then he begins again, historically. Exiled Thucydide knew everything, knew all that a speech can say about democracy. And that leads it to but all it does is it leads you back to where it started. His current mind can only go in circles about what do we do in response to this global catastrophe. And the poem has made an elegant, intellectual, and creative sort of series of expressions that lead nowhere. Now something interesting happens. As Auden begins to think poetically rather than intellectually, whatever solution he needs isn't available through intellectual analysis, psychoanalytic investigation, or historical dialectic. He requires his imagination to be a lamp to offer a new insight. The poem now starts over in the same place, in the bar. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, children afraid of the night, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been haunted or good. So our daily existence is presented to us not as historical, not as an idea, but as an image of lost, frightened children, without direction, without parents, who have never been happy or good, without joy or virtue. And now comes this odd moment in the poem, maybe the oddest moment in the poem, is suddenly Václav Nijinsky appears. Not a word on name on everyone's lips as Hitler invaded Poland. And he, now if you investigate Auden's life, you discover that on the afternoon of September 1st, 1939, he opened Nijinsky's diaries looking for just something that would illuminate it. This is very much like the old Sortus Virgiliana, the way that the Romans would just put their finger on a line from Virgil to tell the future. Many people do this with the Bible. They sort of, where they let it fall. What should I do, God? And then they look and it says, honor your father and mother. And so he did. And the line that he found, and he writes a friend of this. His surprise is Nijinsky. His diaries say, Nijinsky says, I want to cry, but God orders me to go on writing. And so Auden, begins to think about Nijinsky, and Nijinsky, who is in the process of going insane as he's writing this diary, has the insight that Auden lacks. Because if you look at this, what Mad Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart. For the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. And he realizes that Nijinsky has stumbled on the key issue, which is not political, not economic, but theological. It's almost Augustinian as an expression of original sin. That the inability, in a sense, to think outside of one's own self, and that the vision of universal love is contradicted not simply by history or economic policy, but by the very nature of humanity. And here I want to pause from the analysis of the poem to consider what is probably the clearest text in the New Testament about spiritual formation. This is the one part in the New Testament, I think, that you're given a step-by-step, guidelines for this. It is from the second epistle of St. Peter, and it's his map of spiritual formation, which starts where we all start, in the everyday evil of the world. This is where Auden is starting in the bar. There's this global outbreak of the most violent and destructive kind of evil. What does he do? What St. Peter says is, you may come to share in the divine nature after escaping from the corruption that is in the world because of evil desire. For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, virtue with knowledge, knowledge with self-control, self-control with endurance, endurance with devotion, devotion with mutual affection with love. Now, this passage from 2 Peter outlines the proper course of Christian spiritual formation as a step by step progress of the soul, guided by faith from a corrupt world and evil desire. And I think what Peter is also talking about is individual evil desires, not everybody else's evil desire. And by the development of various spiritual practices and disciplines, we are led ultimately to mutual affection and universal love, agape. This is almost exactly the journey that Auden takes in this poem. Now, I don't believe for a moment that Auden had 2 Peter in mind. I don't think that he had Christianity consciously in mind. What I'm suggesting is something more interesting, namely that Auden unconsciously, or perhaps more precisely intuitively, creatively, poetically, was able to perceive and embrace this spiritual course of direction, which was not consonant with Auden's own public beliefs at the time. His imagination, as a lamp rather than a mirror, illuminated inner relationships of human nature that his intellectual assumptions were not yet willing to embrace. And I think the last three stanzas confirm that Auden felt that politics no longer had the larger answers and that he needed something else. Now, he imagines the morning of September 2nd and helpless governors wake to resume their compulsory game. Who can release them now? Who can reach the deaf? Who can speak for the dumb? And the poem now takes a turn that you can either call prophetic, in that the prophet is the one who says truth to authority, or simply you could say humbler, bears witness. The root of the word martyr. Auden says, all I have is a voice to undo the folded lie. What Auden is thinking about is the newspaper. All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensuous man on the street, and the lie of authority, whose buildings grope the sky. Notice the metaphor of blindness. And it's also, almost a rude, intrusive metaphor. There is no such thing as the state. Now, I don't think Auden is saying that as an expression of anarchistic politics. He's saying it as if we go down to the basis of what the human race is, as the American Constitution says, or the Declaration of Independence, it is humanity that formulates the state, not vice versa. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice for the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, the world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere. Now comes two images of light, dotted everywhere, ironic points of light. Why are they ironic? Because they're different than authority. Ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. Why the just? What you see, is you already see that without consciously articulating, he is articulating Augustine's city of God. That there's a city of man, which is about power and might, but always, everywhere, coexisting with this material city is the invisible city of the just, of those who are trying to have lives in accordance with God, wherever the just exchange their messages. Now, notice the verb exchange. It's a verb of communal mutual benefit, exchange their messages. Now, is the poet different from everybody else? No. He sees himself as a member of this invisible, just city. May I, composed like them, of eros and of dust, love and death, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show, and affirming flame. And so, these last two stanzas, end on affirmation and light. Now, it's naive to say that Auden was actually transformed by the creation of this poem in this moment of crisis, or that these words truly chronicle important moments in Auden's spiritual formation entirely, but I think they represent exactly what's going on, that this is however incomplete, an accurate portrayal of the moment where Auden goes from a secular, political, psychoanalytic view of humanity to a theological one. Now, you can't know this for certain, but we do know for certain that a year later he was a Christian. But I think even more important is the fact that Auden suppressed this poem. Poets, in case you don't know this, poets often suppress poems. Why? Because they're stinkers. They don't want anybody to know that they wrote a poem that bad. You see this happening all the time. Auden is, the only, at least in English, poet I know that suppressed several truly great, famous, historically significant poems for reasons that were, that were personal reasons. One of them is Spain 1937, this long poem supporting the Republican efforts in the Spanish Civil War, which Auden said not only contained political lies, but Auden said, it would have been bad enough if I had ever held this wicked doctrine. But what was worse, that he said that I've said them for effect. The poet, wanting, as he later says in a poem, to wow an audience. And so Auden's rejection of this masterful poem had already become part of, which had already become part of the literary history of his age, was a significant involuntary act of self-criticism and courage. Now, remember, what Auden was really objecting to was fundamentally one word, the word or. We must love one another or die. He said that, we must love one another and die was not a lie. Now, I would say that if you have a political frame of mind to say we must love one another or die is not a lie. It might be an exaggeration, but it makes a very reasonable point that if we loved one another more, we would kill each other less. I don't think anybody would deny that hate, leads to more deaths than love does. And so the problem for Auden, I would suggest, is something that the critics have missed. What he objected to was the transactional nature of that statement. If we love one another, then we get less murder, we get less death. If you do A, you then get B. The new Christian Auden, I think, found that transactional nature repugnant. We must love one another is not part of a bargain, it's a divine mandate. It is not something we negotiate. And unfortunately, death is a biological mandate. You can ideologically object to death, and you could, as a postmodernist, say it's a cultural construction, but you're still going to die. And the new Christian Auden understood that the line would only be true if it was revised with and. We must love one another, and we must die. And the poet Auden understood that was not a very good climax for a great poem. Auden had by then cultivated the Christian virtues of humility and self-criticism and was willing to suppress this and other poems that he felt were morally deceptive. And this, I think, is a remarkable act for a poet to do for a poem that is famous throughout the English-speaking world. And I don't think that Auden ever forgot, as it were, where that jump in spiritual formation had taken him. If you look at Auden's last major poem, it's a poem called Ode to Terminus, published in 1968. The poem ends, "And abhorred in the heavens are all self-proclaimed poets who, to wow an audience, utter some resonant lie." So tonight, on this solemn anniversary, in this city fueled by resonant lies, let us honor a poet who took truth seriously. May he, composed like us of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, not be abhorred in heaven, but to be honored by us for his affirming flame. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you. That was a joy and a deeply, for me, profound exploration of an exemplar of the truth and the value of truth in poetry. I don't come to you as a poet. I come as I guess my field is one of a philologist. They don't use that term so much anymore, but I can say what is true of poets is also true of philologists. There's nothing about being a philologist that makes you necessarily a good person. But my study and my interest in philology has revolved around the early years and the early centuries and millennia of poetry. So I thought as we talk a little bit about how poetry plays into spiritual formation, how does it play into being a human being spiritually formed, what if we go back and look at the birth of poetry, and tell the story of poetry as it is in human history? To do that, we have to go back to the desperate days of 2300 BC. A woman named Enkiduanna. She was a priestess of a fertility goddess. She put stylus to clay, and she scratched out, at least what we know, is the first poem. At least that's what it looks like from our perspective 4,400 years ago. It's the first one that we have. She seems to have known she was doing something new, because when she talked about it, she wrote this line. She says, "My king, something has been created that no one has created before." It's not that writing hadn't taken place. It had. It had just been over the millennia and the centuries. Writing systems had been in place in human culture, and yet we seem to only have energy to write receipts and administrative lists. That probably tells you something about human nature, that that's our interest. But this is the first literature that we had, written by the priestess Enkiduanna. And that literature was poetry. And what a strange form of writing it was. It was human language, and yet it was a constrained language. Constrained in length. It was metrical. It was memorable. And it was given to performance. Following its emergence in the late 3rd millennium BC, poetry continued its long predominance throughout the ancient world, making up the majority of the world's great literature. Whether it's Sumerian, as Enkiduanna was writing, or Akkadian, later Ugaritic, and of course Hebrew. Indeed, the majority of the Hebrew Bible is written in verse. The earliest parts of Scripture are poems. Jacob's blessings of his grandsons in Genesis 49. That song that Moses and the Israelites sing on the other side of the Red Sea in celebration in Exodus 15. That event after the Canaanites are wiped out that one time by Jael and Deborah and Barak. As with the case of Auden's poem, poems in verse are often written in times of great change, when the world seems to be recast anew. But turn to the prophets, the Psalter, the wisdom literature of the sages. It's all in verse. It's all in prose. You see, today, if you want to write something important, you pull out your essay. You pull out your book. But in the ancient world, if you wanted to say something important, more often than not, you said it in poetry. Consider the first two chapters of Genesis, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the stories of creation, right? But have you ever noticed that in these two different stories that focus in on different elements of creation, they're both capped with a poem? In Genesis 1, the Lord is casting out his palace, his sacred space, where he puts his image, where life is finally appropriate and it's suitable and things can happen, and he places his image there, man and woman, and then the author, as if he can't contain himself, breaks into a song, and he says, so created humanity. God created humanity in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Man and woman, he created them. Might be hard for us to hear it, but there's a metric there. There's a regulation of the Hebrew. There's a switch. The poet knew he was doing something different. We move on to chapter 2 of Genesis, and the same thing happens, but this time we're focusing in on the creation of humanity. And the woman is the culmination this time, where it was man and woman the first time. It's the woman who's the culmination second time. And again, it's capped in a poem, and it's put in the voice of one of the characters, the man. He sees her and he can't contain himself. He says, this at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called Isha, because she was taken from Ish. You can hear the play in the language there, the feminine form, Isha, taken out of Ish. It somehow works better than woman taken out of man. But why this? Why this prevalence of verse? Why do you turn to poetry when you want to say the most important things? Now, we can't neglect the profane reasons. If you've ever thought about it, poetry is, in its way, a technological innovation. It's information tech. It's like language. It's like writing systems. It's like alphabets. It's like the scroll. It's like, in the Second Temple Jewish period, the codex, or what we call the book. You can put a lot more in a codex than you can in a scroll. That's information tech. That's news you can use. It's like the printing press. It's like the internet. And yes, God save us, it's like the Twitter feed. See, poetry is information tech. Poetry does something because it's regulated by number or meter, and it can direct your attention through repetition of sounds that you just can't unhear once you've heard them. Think about the beginning of the Psalter, Psalm 1. You know how it begins. Blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. But if you've heard it in Hebrew, Ashrei ha'ish asher, you can hear that play on the ah sound, which is a consonant in Hebrew, and shah sound, and the resh sound, and they're rolling over each other, Ashrei ha'ish asher. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. It's like a political slogan, I like Mike, or Built Ford Tough. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it because it's artful language. Look at the first words of Job on the day that he finally opens his mouth and responds to the suffering. He's lost everything he loves. And the first thing he says, the first line of poetry in the book of Job, cursed is the day that I was born. If you read it in Hebrew, Yovad Yom Yivaled Yo. Yovad Yom Yivaled Vo. It's that rolling yods and the vavs and the vuz and the does. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The opening line pops for the Hebrew reader, and it's ingrained in her consciousness. Now, the repetition doesn't merely take place at the level of the sounds, of the body articulating noise, but it happens at the level of the mind, the level of meaning. Consider Psalm 24. Listen to the pairings of ideas. The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell within it. For he has founded it upon the seas. How can I say that in another way? He set it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? You can see how the pairings of ideas and sounds help the poet and the audience remember what was said. Poetry is informational tech. It's not because the majority of the Israelite audience was necessarily illiterate. We actually know that remarkably, probably about 20% or more of the Israelite public were literate. And yet still, vellum and clay tablets are expensive. you're going to say something important, you want to say it in a way that people will remember. People who aren't equipped with scrolls, people who are only equipped with memory and their mouths. Biblical Hebrew poetry is given to comparisons, juxtapositions, usually between two lines. And here we find images and ideas placed side by side, and the hermeneutical electricity is found when you try to find their relationship to one another. You take the two ideas, and where they relate to one another, that's where the power is, that's where the beauty lies. A similar technique is found in East Asian literature, wherein two graphical symbols are paired next to each other, and yet as you're put next to each other, you're instantly begging the audience to make a connection, to find how they relate to each other. This East Asian technique was communicated into the 19th and 20th centuries, and actually found its presence in Western literature through the historical work of Ernest Fenollosa, probably most commonly known through the poem by Ezra Pound. You can probably see it in your Norton anthology right now as I say it, entitled A Station in the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. You can hear the play and the sounds. There's a slant rhyme, crowd and bow. And yet these two ideas, the faces and the petals, don't obviously connect. And yet as we think about it, all of a sudden the vision is received and we can no longer unsee it. There's a similar technique in Hebrew poetry, the juxtaposition of statements and word pictures that demand interpretation. We return to Job, longing for self-annihilation. He doesn't just desire merely suicide, but rather he desires that he never existed in the first place. He reflects on the first night of his life, and in Job chapter 3, verse 7, we read, "May the night be barren, so that no singing comes to it." Job wishes that the night of his birth was barren. And then he says it in another way. He says, what I mean by that is that there not be a family celebration because of the new child who's been born. Note that he does not wish for a day of sorrow. He doesn't wish for mourning on his behalf. He wishes that it be a nothing day, a day of no remembrance one way or another. An idea vividly brought to us in this picture of the barren night. Now, this gets at another feature of ancient and biblical poetry, as well as modern poetry for that matter. And it's this ability, and it's actually the impulse of modern poetry, as well as ancient poetry, to create a friction between the audience and the reader. Verse slows down perception. It slows down the hearing, and it slows down the reading. The poetic line is like a resistor in an electrical current that impedes the flow, causing the audience to stop and to consider and to think and to experience life anew. Russian literary critic Viktor Shklovsky called this ostrenie, estrangement or defamiliarization. See, for Shklovsky, poetic speech was tortured speech. It makes the familiar strange. It makes it new. It makes you see it once again like that traveler gone on the 2-week vacation who walks back into your living room and says, wait a minute, this is where I live? You see it afresh. You see it anew. It's a move of estrangement to talk about a barren night. It's a move of estrangement to talk about your lover as a summer's day. It's an act of estrangement to liken love to a red, red rose. And it's a beautiful act of estrangement to use biblical beatitudinal language to express the grace that's found in life's pains and frustrations, as Gioia does in his poem Prayer at Winter Solstice. He writes, "Blessed is the road that keeps us homeless. Blessed is the mountain that blocks our way." We might experience the Beatitudes anew. Like the prophet Nathan, who comes and challenges that murderous and adulterous David by telling him a story that defamiliarizes his recent history so that he can finally see himself anew. Poetry causes us to see ourselves oftentimes anew. The author of Ecclesiastes performs a marvelous work of estrangement in describing the realities of old age. And he uses the imagery of a building. Listen to how he uses the imagery of a building closing at the end of a day. But he's talking about the end of the human life. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed. They are afraid also of what is high. The terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms. The grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails. Because man is going to his eternal home, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. We're drawn back to that poem. There's a hauntedness about it. We can read it both at the level of the metaphor and at the level of the reference point. We can read it both as about late and old age, or we can read it about the closing of a business. There's a mournful dirginess about it. But what is the source of the mourning? Is it in the pain of bone decay? The strong men are bent. Is it in the loss of teeth? The grinders are few, so they've stopped working. Is it the coming on of cataracts? Those behind the windows have dimmed. Or is it the gray hair? The almond tree is in its blossom. Or maybe it's just the subtle routine of the end of a workday and how that plays into the aging process of the human. You see, poetry gives voice to the more profound elements of human experience, even when discussing the most mundane events. It reminds us that suffering of this life can be as profound in its glory as it is in its tragedy. We should not be surprised that when man first sees woman, when Ish sees Isha, he sings a song. And yet we should also not be surprised that when Christ is on the cross and he takes the sin of the world upon his shoulders, he speaks to us in verse. In this passage, Christ, the last Adam, puts his humanity on display, giving voice to the grand mystery of the cross, that somehow the second person of the Trinity might look to the first person of the Trinity and say, why have you forsaken me? The humanity of Christ can only find solidarity in the words of the human psalmist who, centuries before, felt also isolated from God. You see, poetry does something that other speech forms do not. It humanizes us. Ultimately, poetry is humanizing for humans who are made in the image of God. It gives us expression that goes beyond the data transfer, that goes beyond the proposition. It gives us expression of the whole self. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
Very comfy chair.
Yes, thank you for that. That was fascinating. I know we're running a little bit behind, so we'll ask just two quick questions. The first one to you, Dana, and then the second one to both of you, so we can fit in a few questions from the audience as well before we wrap up for the evening. So, Dana, you spent your time talking about a political poem by Auden that ultimately discarded politics as the source of hope. And yet, in many of your writings, you have lamented that in many ways, Christian intellectual life has done exactly the opposite. That concern for the arts has largely been subsumed with attention to politics. How have we gotten to this place, and is there a way back?
Well, I think the problem you're talking about, which is a general problem in intellectual life, certainly academic life now, is that the only value people seem to see in art, in poetry, is as a vehicle of political expression, which is to say they take this medium which talks to us in the fullness of our humanity in all kinds of ways that are in excess of what we can communicate with an idea. I mean, the power of a poem is it can say things that are beyond what words can say. That a poem communicates to you by inciting your memory, inciting your imagination, your emotions. You have a physical reaction to it, which leads you to meanings that are meanings beyond words. This is true of the visual arts and music, of course, because they don't use words, but it's even true of poetry. And what we see instead is a fundamental misunderstanding of what poetry is and what art is, and it's seen only as a means of ideological communication. So I think it's an intellectual and an artistic failure both. Now the question is, can we restore our culture? And the fact is that, I mean, we are here to show an affirming flame, are we not? I mean, we are in a broken culture. We have a broken academy, but humanity needs the arts. Humanity needs the arts because the arts are what speaks to us most naturally as incarnate human beings who have both a body and a soul. It's a way of us understanding our experience through an experiential medium. It's philosophy and science, are very powerful, but how many of you can do calculus, can do cell biology, can do these things? It's not the way we fundamentally think. It's a discipline that we can learn as a specialized type of knowledge, but the arts are universal. So if we want to restore our culture, we are going to restore it by restoring the vitality, the health, the reach, the love of the arts. If we, and any other way of doing will fail. It will simply fail because it simply becomes another kind of specialized discourse, which in a nutshell is the failure of American conservatism in the last half century, maybe, if not longer. And so it's the failure of Christianity in America right now. Christianity has lost its historical, innate, and what I would think unreplaceable connection with the beautiful. We are drawn to the good and the true through beauty. And I think even more important in terms of our society is that we have, in academic discourse, discarded the concept of beauty as a positive and productive or true idea.
So it is a pleasure to get to ask this question to both a poet and a philologist. And that, Dana, you've often argued that part of the power of poetry is its ability to purify language. We are at a time where language is muddied, information streams are siloed, increasingly cognitive biases are more easily confirmed, facts and alternative facts are contested, and entire industries have been built up around devising resonant lies. So how can poetry purify the language of our time?
Well, let me first of all say that by saying purify the language of the tribe, I was quoting Eliot, who was quoting Mallarmé, who was praising, curiously, Edgar Allan Poe. But I think that the Auden's quote that that the real purpose of poetry, or part of the real purpose of poetry, is to resist uttering the resonant lie. Poetry, which existed before there was ever writing. That's the challenge of the philologist. You only know the moment when it starts entering writing. But it's a universal human technology. There's not a culture we've found on the planet that doesn't have a way of heightening speech into a kind of memorable verbal music. The purpose of poetry is to create a slightly hypnotic spell to relax us so that we bring our memories, our emotions, our intuition, our imagination to the fore, so that a transaction can happen between the poet and the listener, the poet and the reader, that will not happen in other kinds of discourse. That hypnotic spell creates the temptation to lie, to delude, to con. And I think what Auden is saying is, hey, I can do the spell, but I'm going to hold myself to the moral mandate of speaking the truth as I see the truth. That's why Auden, for me, is important. That's why Auden's transformation from a political poet to a theological poet, I think, is an extraordinarily important moment in modern literature. So, how do we begin? We begin by, I think somebody said this, don't tell a lie. I think it's even written in a book somewhere. And so, so the refusal of lying as you are practicing your art.
Yeah, I think I reiterate everything that you're saying there, and I think what you have with poetry is an opportunity because of the constraint of the line. It forces you in many ways to say things that you might not have otherwise thought, to slip through the filters of what your sort of polite society that's going on at the top level of your head is operating in, or maybe whatever the political discourse is that you're interacting with. And there's something about the form and the constraint of the poem. And I am speaking here of form, I know you've talked elsewhere about prose poetry and whatnot, but this idea of constraint causing you to choose your words just so that they are truthful and that they are the right words. I mean, that's one thing I think that we've lost so much, particularly now, in much of the discourse in social media, is that the need for the hot take and the quick word has surpassed the thinking about the right word, right? And I think that's why it has the ability of at least, if not purifying our language, affecting a reformation of our language, maybe I should say.
A way of saying it is just the best way of purifying the language is not to quibble with other people's language. Right. It's to offer exempla of excellence. And education should be based on exempla of excellence. Learning, reading the finest text, looking at the finest art, hearing the best music, because that is transformative. Art awakens us in the completeness of our humanity to become alert, to it, and to refine and perfect it. It's a kind of spiritual formation, but embodied in a sensual discourse.
Amen. Yeah.
So we're going to take some questions from the audience, but then after that, before we break up, perhaps we can convince you to recite a few of your poems, Dana, at the very end. You can be,
if anyone's still around.
You can be thinking about which ones you'd select. But we'll take questions from the audience. Those of you who have been to Trinity Forum events before know that we have 3 guidelines for all questions. We simply ask the audience to give questions that are brief, that are civil, and that all questions should be in the form of a question. Please raise your hand and wait till you are called on and the microphone is with you. We have 2 people very quickly arriving with mics, so right here on the aisle. Matthew, right up your second row.
Thank you both for the presentation. Especially, Dana, I wanted to ask you, when you think about people who are writing poetry who know they're not going to be as famous as Auden, but they're very dedicated to it, and maybe early on they think, well, I can't write about this or that because someone I know might read it. And then a few years later, they find that in their striving for artistic excellence, are writing things they never thought they would write, because the honesty and the search for artistic excellence seem to combine. I was wondering if you had any observations on that as a spiritual discipline and writing poetry as a alternative maybe to Sudoku every day.
Well, if you think of poetry as a hypnotic spell, it's not this one that the audience says, yes, master, what should I do? It's just a kind of, the way that music, the rhythm of music begins to make part of your body more alert. Poetry is the spell. That spell works first and foremost on the poet himself or herself. That spell, and that's what you're talking about, reaching for a rhyme, reaching for a meter, reaching for a form, you get into a kind of heightened state of both observation and creation. And if you do this, as any spiritual discipline, if you pray every day, 10 years later, prayer means something very different from you than when you started. If you, in a sense, cultivate your imagination and your creativity through poetry, you will find that it's transformative. And to a certain degree, it doesn't matter at some point if you're going to become famous or not, if you're going to publish it. You have become more alert to your own existence.
Scott, anything to add?
Yeah, I remember in college, I had a writing professor, Henry Hart, who gave a similar picture. His, of course, is basketball, not spiritual formation. He said, you've got guys who are playing down at the Y every Saturday for basketball, and then you've got, dating myself here, Michael Jordan. Okay, and not everyone's going to be Michael Jordan, but you can get pretty good shooting threes down at the Y. And there is a there's a discipline to it. And yes, as a Christian, there's a spiritual discipline to that, disciplining the way your mind finds expression in the Word.
I mean, I think the point of my talk, if I summarize it in two sentences, is that spiritual formation of using your imagination is very powerful. But secondly, it doesn't excuse you for telling a lie. It doesn't excuse you from the self-delusions so common among poets, so common among artists. You know, that a poet and an artist is not exempt, you know, from the communal morality in that sense.
Other questions? John Gizzi.
Thank you, and thank you both for a most moving presentation. Question is very simple. Agreeing that Auden was an important poet on the politics of his time, Robert Lowell was also very significant in the 1960s. Who today is a poet who is also commentator on social mores and politics that you recommend we read?
That's hard because I think that the political discourse and the poetic discourse have pulled apart a lot. In the United States, the political poets that interest me the most are British or Irish. Seamus Heaney, Derek Mann, Tony Harrison. These are poets, you know, who are, you know, especially these poets that come out of Northern Ireland, you know, because it's, you know, in a sense, the everyday, I think, you know, sort of conflicts, I think have had to articulate and create a poetic language that is commensurate with the political situation. Somehow in the United States, I don't read many poets. There'll be individual poems that strike me as very significant. Today, as September 11th, you can't forget Billy Collins' poem, The Names, which is a poem that came out of the names of the people who died. And it's, you know, in a sense, it generates the poem out of the fact and the explanation. But Billy Collins is not otherwise what you'd think of as a significant political poet. He's a poet of personal humor, of imagination. But I think I would say the poetry that's come out of Northern Ireland in the last half century is the most interesting political poetry in the English language. And part of the thing is that it's murderous conflicts between people who an outsider would almost think of as indistinguishable. They've got a religious or an ideological difference that seems so minor in terms of the larger sense of humanity.
We'll take one last question right here. Second row.
Thanks so much to both of you. My question is, if reading poetry and writing poetry are spiritual practices, are they for everybody, just like prayer or participating in the Eucharist? Or do you have to have something special to be a poet or to read poetry as a spiritual practice?
Simple answer, no. Not everybody should be a poet. Not everybody should be a musician. Not everybody who is serious about their spiritual life would necessarily do a particular spiritual discipline. I mean, extreme example, mortification. You know, in terms of actually giving yourself some kind of mild pain, in a sense, to discipline your body. That is the discipline, you know, of a saint, you know, rather than an ordinary person. But I do think that the experience of poetry in the audience, as a reader, as a listener, is something everyone should do, which is to say, to be alert to the power of poetry as it uses words in the fullness of their meaning. So we have this illusion that words, you know, are very neat vessels of meaning, that, you know, you can put the words together and it gives you an absolutely pure message. What poetry says is that words do not communicate like a laser, they radiate meanings. And so in a sense, to understand the broader meanings, I think that's something that is universal. And secondly, for the way that poetry puts you in touch with your own memories, imaginations, desires, emotions, I think is an extremely important precondition for spiritual growth. But that's more about the reception of poetry than the writing of poetry.
I mean, if I could add, I think one of the points in what I was trying to draw out is that, at least in the ancient world, and through most of human history, and you mentioned this as well, poetry really is something for everybody. It is not, it's not ruled out. It's not just for the luxuriant. It's not just for those who have free time. It's not just for amusement. So if you flip the question around a little bit and say, who is poetry not for? I'd say it's for everyone. And yet, of course, given all the caveats, it's sort of like sports and like music too. And yet, I think if we pay attention to, think about the calls of Scripture. I mean, Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of yourself, and all of your strength, right? Your strength out in the world. He's citing Moses, Deuteronomy 6. And think about that. I mean, what is poetry, what is verse doing? It is this very succinct and elegant way of bringing it really does bring your body into the work of communication and into the work of articulating truth. And so often in the Scriptures, it's worship, but it's also lament. And it's Job dealing with the fact that he's lost everything he loves. There is a very, as I try to point out, there's a very human element to that, and it's for all of us. It's not just for people who went to college and studied in poetry programs, right? And so that may not be the thing that you excel at or you spend a whole lot of time at because you're going another direction, but I think it is a discipline, not just for communication, but also for the way that you think about the world, as you were getting at, the way that you see the world, perceive it, and articulate it to those around you.
So before we wrap up, Dana, could we prevail upon you to recite one or two of your poems?
Let me do two short poems. You can get up here. The first one is very light, although it ends rather dark. Helen Sung, a wonderful jazz pianist, asked, if I would write lyrics for her. So we did an album of jazz songs, and this is the first lyric that I wrote. And it's a LA poem. It's about the beautiful people in LA and the power that their beauty gives them and what happens to that power. It's called Pity the Beautiful. Pity the beautiful, the dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies, granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows, the hotties, the knockouts, the 10s out of 10, the drop-dead gorgeous, the great leading men. Pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis whose luck's gone lousy. Pity the gods, no longer divine. Pity the night, the stars lose their shine. And or as the Bible says, all flesh is grass. And let me close with a poem that's about marriage. It's kind of squeaky stage. I think if I get on, I don't mean to step on you. I think if I don't, span the juncture, it's a little quieter. I don't see many poems about happy marriages. Now I know that it's more fun, it's more to write about if you have an unhappy one. And sometimes if you write about your marriage, you'll make it unhappy. But I think, the happy marriage is something that's fascinating. And what's fascinating about it is very hard to describe because part of a marriage is that the couple, over the course of their lifetime, create a private language. And it's the most intimate language we'll ever speak. But you really only speak it with one other person. And it's terribly fragile. If you lose one of the people, you lose the language. But it's so profound. And so I wrote this poem which is to my wife, called Marriage of Many Years. Most of what happens beyond words. The lexicon of lip and fingertip defies translation into common speech. I recognize the musk of your dark hair. It always thrills me, though I can't describe it. My finger on your thigh does not touch skin. It touches your skin. We'll wait till the phone calls. My finger on your thigh does not touch skin. It touches your skin, warming to my touch. You are a language I have learned by heart. This intimate patois will vanish with us. It's only native speakers. Does it matter? Our chants, our dances round the fire, performed the sorcery we most desired. They bound us in a spell time could not break. Let the young vaunt their ecstasy. We keep our tribe of two in solemn secrecy. What mattered most, what must be lost, was never lost on us. Thank you so much. I knew somebody's phone would go off. Thank you very much.
As we wrap up, I want to let you all know that the Catholic Writer Today, which Dana authored and which we highly recommend, is for sale at the book table. Hardcover is $25, paperback is $16. His poems, 99 poems, new and selected. Again, you will not want to miss this. This paperback is for sale at $8. Dana will be signing them at the book table. Do recommend that you go and take a look. We also want to highly recommend that you consider another invitation, and that should be on all of your chairs, to join the Trinity Forum Society. Members of the Trinity Forum Society help make possible events such as this and really help advance the mission of the Trinity Forum. At a time when our public discourse is often characterized by the trivial, the sensationalized, the angry, and the depressing, we try to provide a place for both intellectual rigor and warm hospitality in talking about what matters most for our time, or indeed all time. There are no other places like it, and we hope that you will be part of the community that helps make that possible. There are several benefits to joining the Trinity Forum Society, which include tonight only a free copy of Dana's book, The Catholic Writer Today. In addition to that, you receive quarterly copies of our Trinity Forum readings, many selections of which are over there on the book table as well. I will note that there are 2 different poetry readings that the Trinity Forum has published that Dana has written the introduction for, and you will not want to miss them. One is an anthology of poetry by John Donne, to which he wrote the introduction, and the other is an anthology of poetry by Gerard Manley Hopkins. So we encourage you to check that out. For more information on that, you can talk to any of my colleagues who I believe will be standing. If you could just wave your arm so that they can see who you are, that'd be fantastic. We also want to encourage you to share this event with others, whether on Twitter or on Facebook, share the video as well, and hope that you will join us for future evening conversations. Our next Trinity Forum evening conversation will be in this very room in less than a month. On October 7th, we'll be welcoming Augustinian scholar James K.A. Smith, along with Washington Post columnist Liz Brunig, to talk about Augustine and his thoughts on real-world spirituality and pilgrimage. And then our next event with our partners, Regent and RTS, will be coming soon. We have not yet picked the dates on those, but stay tuned for the next invitation there. As Jeff mentioned, this is really the first in a three-part series. We're very excited about it on art, faith, and formation, and we'd love to have your feedback on this as well as your involvement in future evening conversations. As we wrap up, it is always appropriate to end with thanks, and an evening like this does not happen without many people pitching in and to whom gratitude is owed. I want to thank again our partners in hosting this, Jeff Greenman and Chairman Roger Lang at Regent, Scott Redd at Reformed Theological Seminary, as well as thank their able staff and faculty colleagues who gave so much of their time and effort in preparing for tonight. And in particular, Lucila Crina from Regent and Timoteo Sazzo from Reformed Theological Seminary. I'd also like to thank our volunteers in the back who've done so much to help us. Elise Amesdraz, Matthew McKnight, Alexandra O'Brien, as well as Trinity Forum intern emeritus Christian Barnard. Thanks again to our always stellar photographer, Clay Blackmore, to my fantastic colleagues, Alyssa Abraham, Rebecca Noyes, and brand new events coordinator, Hannah Smith. Tonight was her maiden effort and hit it out of the park, along with our excellent interns, Emily Scholes and Megan Eichmeyer. Thank you again, Dana and Scott, for a fascinating conversation, and to each of you for coming, and good night.